Who would like to start? We'll take 3 or 4 questions and then offer the opportunity for our panellists to respond.
Everyone's exhausted.
Everyone is so tired. We do have refreshments afterwards. So it's just 15 minutes. We can do it.
You can do a dialogue, Elaine.
I can do it. I'll talk to my... Yes. There, wonderful.
It's not a question, it's just a comment to what Zeynep was saying. Sorry. It's just a comment following up on Zeynep's presentation saying, so what I was hearing for the last 2 years from friends working at NGOs, that obviously there were hundreds of people who were forced to sign the documents to repatriate to Syria, but they weren't able to publicize them out of fear. And finally today we have, I just want to say the Amnesty International published a report today on these forced deportation, and this is the first official publication by a sort of famous international NGO. So just wanted to let everyone know that the report has been published just as a proof that it's been happening for a long time.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have Palladia, a question here, thank you.
Hello, I have a question to Ms. Fakhoury.
Yes.
Where is she?
Yes, I'm here.
Behind head. Can you maybe say something about the effects of what you were saying? Like, so the politics are these different actors who are trying to basically use this claim to return, politics of refugee return. Are they successful in that? Like, are people actually listening? Is it working? Or because sometimes I have the feeling that, I mean, what is the dynamics basically between what people are presenting and how maybe other political actors are reacting, and also maybe the people, either Syrians or Lebanese in Lebanon, are reacting to that?
Yes. Would you like to collect questions, or
We'll
should I
take,
just ask?
if we could take 2 more, if we have 2 more in the room. Thank you. Giuliano, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder whether, if, as relevant as Margaret's pipe, the rabbit-duck illusion is also relevant when talking about rights. What I mean by that is that organisations that are advocating for rights often do so on the basis of their own experience and their own self-identity. And I think there's probably a need to interrogate the way they engage in sort of reflexive thinking. I say that because I think Anna made a very good point earlier about secularity and neutrality. And I think, and then there's another question here about how NGOs define themselves. Well, I think liberal humanitarianism has often used the idea of neutrality or claim to neutrality in a functional way, in a tactical way. But it also becomes embedded in a belief system.
Absolutely.
And it becomes embedded in a belief system in which, in fact, they call themselves NGOs, or we call ourselves NGOs, but not really non-governmental at all, thinking about our dependencies, political and economic. And really that's an escape to an imagined neutral space of civil society. At the same time, there's a point there about conceptions of one's own religiosity or non-religiosity, and I think if we're considering humanitarian ideas of history, they're at least as mystical in their teleologies as religious theories of history are. And in fact, not only does that serve as a basis for or an inspiration, but it also serves as justification. What I mean by that is I think humanitarians often justify their own existence and their own work on the basis of a sort of rationalist, secular and modern theodicy, which is that there's this progressivist idea, which is the long march of progress, but obviously there's some friction along the way and there's a bit of fallout, so we'll be the ones who deal with that. And I think that is a religious basis which ends up translating in a sort of neutral or neutralist belief system.
Thank you, Juliana. One more. Yes, Estela, thank you.
I have a question to Tamirace. In one of your slides, you were mentioning like the pro-Assad and anti-Assad coalitions vis-à-vis the politics of return and how that differs. But then you also mentioned like that both the Shiite and Maronite, Christian Maronite religious authorities are actually advocating for the return of the Syrians. So, like, small premise, absolutely, like, we know that not all of Maronites, like, are with the Kataib, like, with phalangists, or whatever. Like, of course, that is much more complicated. But I was wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit on that, maybe thinking of the Kataib, although they're not part of the present government. I was thinking of this sort of intersectional space, like between politics and religion, and wondering whether it's really still about anti-Assad or pro-Assad vis-a-vis the politics of return. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's wonderful questions, and we'll be able to ask more questions over refreshments. But I'm going to take this opportunity to just ask the question to the panel, including Zeynep, and I hope that you can hear me here as well. If you could also offer some reflections on the relationship between the theory and the practice of rights when it comes to thinking through the roles played by members of local communities in responses to displacement. So just tying it back to some of the themes that we've been exploring throughout the conference. What is it to think about rights through the framework of communities rather than individuals? How do we think that through, both from a theoretical and practical lens? So what is the relationship between the theory and the practice of rights when it comes to the roles played by local communities or community-based rights frameworks? So I will invite responses from Myra left to right. So we will start with Anna, and then we'll work our way to Zeynep. Thank you.
Just quickly to pick up on the observation here, I think that it's fascinating. I mean, what you're describing is basically the political theology of humanitarianism. It is extraordinary to my mind that actual political theologians, people who wear that badge professionally as I do, have not worked on humanitarianism. There is a new volume coming out very shortly, but it's mainly Global South focused, which again I find, I mean, in one sense interesting, but in another sense bizarre, because I think precisely these are operating theodicies of modernity, and we need to understand their production in those terms, and they do have mystical kind of structures to them as well. So I think, you know, absolutely, I completely agree with that. I think we should also overturn the fact, just as you're problematizing the role of NGOs in terms of they're not very non-governmental really in terms of where their funding comes from, etc. So you're raising the question of dependencies and codependencies in practice and the power of that. I've just come back from Hungary. I was in Budapest working with churches who under the 2011 Act are not allowed to call themselves churches, who are attempting to work in the transit zones, have been repelled, are working with street homeless, Roma, etc. And the problem for me is, and I know this is a controversial thing to say, that the Hungarian churches are captured by the capital of the state, by the money of the state. And that's a really complicated situation. So what looks like independence is not independence, they're no freer than an NGO is of those issues of codependency. So it plays all ways. And there are complex political theologies going on there in the Hungarian context that construe things in that way. Can I have 2 more minutes while you go this way to think about the question I haven't thought about?
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. Tamirace, thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for your questions. First, of course, I focused on political parties and leaders of communities in that regard in order to show how the politics of refugee return has become embroiled in geopolitical interests. And one of my main aims is to show that any policy template on the politics of refugee return in Lebanon is not going to work unless actors are well aware in how return is overlapping with historical legacies, temporalities of violence, discontinuities of rivalries that are being configured and reconfigured right now. And as long as these policy templates remain disconnected from an understanding of conflict spirals and from fragmented actors' understandings of the politics of return, I do not believe that there is any normative response or any rights-based politics that is going to ensue. So this is why in my current research that I'm going to publish, I actually shed light on clashing geopolitical responses to return, and I show how it's very difficult to untangle them, and that it's very important to empirically understand them and trace them in order to, show where are the interlocking rivalries and why I predict, this politics of refugee return to evolve into a very polarizing cleavage in the 2-3 years to come in the region, especially when it comes to Lebanon. Of course, Lebanese communities are not so naive. They know that political actors and local actors, especially religious actors, do instrumentalize the politics of refugee return, and also refugees are well aware of that. And the biggest proof, are currently the protests that are unfolding in Lebanon, in which people are actually claiming to dismantle the sectarian-based model of politics, which thrives on political elites, leadership, and ignorance of people's agencies and citizens' agencies. Thank you, Estella, for your question. This is, of course, a fascinating question, and I didn't have time, but of course it's very important to look at the intersectarian but also the intra-sectarian schisms and divisions that happen, for instance, when it comes to the differences regarding the Phalangist or the Kataib and the Lebanese forces, and how at the same time Lebanese political parties' positions fluctuate with regards to their interests and shifting loyalties within the Syrian conflict. I would have loved to talk more about that. And of course, there is more than the binary of the anti-Assad and pro-Assad regime. For instance, what I wanted to show when I gave you the 3 examples at the end, showing that it's geopolitics, but it's also about how they position and they deploy their authority within Lebanon's territory, how they use fragmented governance in order to strengthen territorial sovereignty, but also, how they thrive to become security managers, for example, or how they would like to cast themselves as mediators in the context of a Lebanese state that is failing to provide solutions. And within this context, I use the theory of fragmented governance that I didn't have time to elaborate on here, but so this research is forthcoming soon, and I would love to share it with you.
Thank you. And Zeynep, if you'd like to offer any reflections, thank you.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do, thank you.
Yes. Okay. So I hear the voice coming from the audience with a, it's slightly echoing, and I hope that I correctly understood the question. It was about the returns from Turkey and the documents that the refugees were kind of directly or indirectly forced to sign, and that the reporting of this phenomenon by NGOs, international NGOs working on that question. I think that was the question.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, it was both a comment, but also drawing attention to the Amnesty International report. Absolutely, that's been published today. There was also
that's it.
There was also the comment of. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, the Amnesty International report, it is released today. It was about the returns, and there were also interviews with people, and estimates that over the past few months, it's hundreds of returns from Turkey. The Turkish authorities claim that there is a total of 315,000 people who have left for Syria from Turkey, and all those returns. But the interviews collected by Amnesty that it's hardly many people. They are not very much aware of the documents they sign, or they don't have any other option. But I also want to remind you that it's the background of these returns and signing the documents. Already in July, last summer, Turkey announced, it was in August 2019, Turkey announced that the Syrian refugees who stay out of the cities, Turkish cities where they are registered, will be forced to return to their initial registration towns. And it was the governorate of Istanbul that announced that they will, if they find people, they will check the identity cards, and if they find out that they are not registered in Istanbul, so they will be detained in removal centers. And on 27 August, the Istanbul governor informed that 16,000 persons have been detained in removal centers across Turkey, and almost one-third were unregistered Syrians. Under Turkish law, applicants and holders of international protection, as well as temporary protection beneficiaries, are required to have a residence in the province in which they were registered. And since I don't have time, I cannot very much give you details, but I also had made some fieldwork in Turkey before I left Turkey. There are huge registration problems in Turkey, so many Syrians are not registered. So already in summer started to implemented a big operation to check the identity cards and registration status of the Syrians and put them in a remove. Normally, the objective publicly announced was to remove, to move those people from Istanbul or other cities to the towns, Turkish towns, where they are registered.
Thank you so much, Zeynep.
But also presumed to sign voluntary return documents.
I'm sorry
to
to
Syria.
interrupt, Zeynep, but we're going to have to finish shortly as it's 6 o'clock here.
Okay, that's it. Okay.
Thank you so much, Zeynep, and thank you to all of our panellists. I will just turn to Anna to offer those closing remarks for this panel on bringing together the theory and practice of where the community fits in these debates. And then I will offer very brief closing remarks for the conference, and then we will have refreshments. And we will finish by about 6 7:07.
Okay, in that case, I will be brief and polemic. And will speak for myself as opposed to echoing anybody in my research as the disclaimer. I think that we're in a time of resistance where the rights framework is shrinking and so deeply threatened that the role of local communities has to be one of figuring rupture and living in rupture in all its senses. It has to be part of interruptive practices, because this is the only way that there will be a conduit to rights. And I think that I go with Simone Weil's sense that this is not, those interruptive practices are not the fullness of justice. We can't romanticize them in that sense, but they are at very least the proxy for rights. But what a desperate state of affairs that all we can do is live with the proxy of rights.
Please join me in thanking the panel.